With me here, Afka, CRC student, as a moderator here. We will discuss about kind of topic of today, this Wednesday, which is very serious, conversion errors, the religious alternative to Kejawen and their discontents. Okay, we have also our speaker, Bapak Martin van Bruynesen. So before we give the floor to him, maybe I should to introduce what the topic we'll discuss about. The conversion of communities. It is related about the 65-66 killings in the past history of Indonesia. And Martin, recent observation among Javanese Buddhist communities and the successful Salafi preaching informally Abangan communities from the basis of reflection he wishes to share in this discussion. Many of the villages that converted to Christianity, Islam, or Buddhism later had a second thought when they discovered that Puritan teachers and preachers forbade them to continue practice that were dear to them. Out of practice such as nyadran, bersih desa, and etc. So there's a lot of abstract that I have to read, but to make shorter, give the floor for Pak Martin.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for being here in such a large number. I had expected 5 or 6 people, but I'm glad so many people are interested in the subject. This is going to be a talk about work in progress, and my thoughts have not crystallized yet. So I may be contradicting myself many times. It may be very kacau, and I do not mind if you make even more kacau by interrupting me and contradicting me. This one works better?
Closer.
Closer. Oh, okay. So it started out with observations of people who had converted to a new religion, and in retrospect started having second thoughts about it. Was that the right choice? I'm really happy in my new religion. Don't I have to do things that I don't really want to do? And why do they not to do the things that my parents used to do and that we think are very important part of our identity? Why does this religion want to change me? Now, traditionally, such response would be very slow and people would gradually just ignore all the instructions of the religion. But in a period of intense pressure to come to an official religion as existed in the 1970s, 1980s, people really had to have one of the 5 recognized religions. And if they diverted from it, it was perhaps politically dangerous. So there was a lot of pressure. And therefore, the feeling of being coerced to do things that you did not really want to do was perhaps more prevalent than in the past. Although I will tell you later that in the 1970s, there was a similar period when people suddenly started thinking, well, but this is not the Islam that I converted to. I mean, they are demanding me to do things that do not fit my culture. And we see the emergence of people who reject that form of Islam in favor of the Javanese cultural response that is inspired and perhaps influenced by Islam, but is certainly not Sharia oriented. Now, I had been looking at Islamization of Indonesia for a long time. I've been doing research on Islam in Indonesia for about 40 years. And many of my observations have concerned Islamization in one form or another. And I've always seen Islamization as a process. It is not something that happens at one particular point where you pronounce the Shahada. No, it is a process that has taken many centuries, and it is still going on. Islamization of Indonesia is not complete. And in the next century, it will not be complete. It will never be complete. It is a process that goes on, and Islam will continue to change. Its understanding of Islam will continue to change. I found a sympathetic account of my interpretation of Islamization in an early article by Merle Ricklefs, the great Merle Ricklefs, who I'm proud later become my friend. He has an article, it was one of his first publications in the early 1970s, 6 Centuries of Islamization in Java. And it is a very stimulating article. What he emphasizes there is, for the Javanese in the period of transition, converting to Islam did not mean getting rid of the religion you had before, but it was simply adding something to what you already had. It was adding one ilmu or ilmu to all the other ilmu you already had. In Babatana Jawi, kita bisa, we can read that people in that period, says the Babat, converted, were interested in Islam because they were obsessed by kadigdayan and kasakten, these supernatural powers. It was in order to acquire supernatural powers that people went to meditate in a forest or on a mountaintop, went through various forms of ascetic exercises, and adding Islam and the various meditations, recitations, and spiritual voyages of Islam, especially the Hajj, at that time still a very dangerous, far journey, was an attractive form of acquiring spiritual powers. People, the first people who went on the Hajj, no doubt, also learned about scriptural Islam a little bit, but especially they perceived the Hajj as a search of spiritual power, of purification of the self, of getting rid of all things held us back, but becoming a more spiritually pure and spiritually powerful person. People who performed that were usually people from the upper layer of society, because those were the ones who needed kasukten and kadekdai most. Islam in the early period enters Indonesian societies from the top down. And it's only people in the middle strata and the lower strata who gradually imitate, little by little, what they see the older, the higher people practice. Returning Hajis became teachers for the entire community. And the process of Islamization is a process in which this traveling to the center, to Mecca, and returning as a reformer, trying to correct the religious beliefs and the religious practices of your neighbors, of your equals, but also of the people below you, is an important part of this process of Islamization. So we see in the course of the past 6, 7 centuries, wave upon wave of reform, brought by people who have studied in the Middle East, like our Ustad, who are now serving us on social media, those who have traveled in the Gulf, play exactly the same role as all their predecessors who traveled to Mecca in more difficult circumstances. The last wave of reform in this whole series of waves, and there will be more later waves, but the last wave we can perceive is the wave of Salafism. And perhaps we may even say that the Gerakan Hijrah is an extension of the wave of Salafism, or a popularization of the wave of Salafism, in which people are no longer part of a Salafi Jama'ah, but their entire life has become Salafized. People who do hijrah follow many practices of the Salafi, although they may not become themselves Salafis, or they may not even be aware that they are Salafis. Now, my interest in Buddhism, which has a very different history, emerged at the beginning of my research on Indonesia 40 years ago. At that time, there were debates about how Indonesia was Islamized and who did it. Snoek Gegronje and other Dutch colonial scholars had insisted that Islam came to Indonesia probably from Gujarat in western India, northwestern India. Others offered Bengal as an alternative. When Indonesia became independent, many Muslims thought that this is a colonial perspective. Why do they tell us we have a second-hand Islam? Wasn't it Arabs who Islamicized us? The Indonesian Muslims have always wanted to be Islamicized by Arabs. I mean, it's first-hand Islam rather than second-hand. There was another theory that said, well, in fact, the Wali who Islamicized Indonesia were Chinese. And in fact, if you read the Babatana Jawi, there is good reason to believe that indeed they came north from Champa, it says in the Babat, and perhaps from China. There was a famous book that had this theory that claimed to chronicles that had been held in a kelenteng in Semarang, which proclaimed that all the people, all the Islamizers of Java in the 14th century were Chinese. And a Javanese historian, what's his name? I'm sorry, I have a blackout. I don't have the name of the historian. A famous professor here at Gajah Mada also, in a book on the fall of Majapahit, repeated that theory. Now, both the original book and the book by the historian about runtuhnya Majapahit were banned for political reasons because they created too much unrest. Because Indonesians thought of Chinese as more or less the opposite of Muslims. And how could Indonesia have been Islamicized by Chinese? It's even worse than being Islamicized by Indians. And it would be so much better if it was Arabs who did it. Now, I thought if we look at Buddhism, which was then experiencing a very recent revival, I noticed that there is the same process. We see the first bhikkhu in Indonesia were Chinese bhikkhu, a few. And for most Indonesians, Buddhism is closely associated with the Chinese. But the Buddhist revival movement from the 1950s on is context not only with China, but with Burma, Myanmar, and Thailand, and especially Sri Lanka. And major influences on on the new major Indonesian Buddhism came from Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Theravada. Perhaps the fact that the Chinese, the Mahayana school, various Mahayana schools of Buddhism, that is perhaps the reason why for indigenous Indonesians, Theravada, the southern school, which is different from the Chinese form of Buddhism, was more attractive. Well, anyway, I was looking at, I often visited a vihara in Bandung, where I then was doing research on Islam. On Sundays, I went to the vihara and spoke to the people there. And I noticed that the Buddhist community is quite divided. There are many competing schools. And I heard about a very small school that tried to form an indigenous Indonesian Buddhism. Like many years later, NU introduced this concept of Islam Nusantara, the Islam that is rooted here and it is embedded in local culture. This school, a very small group of people, Priai, mostly of Kebatinan background, wanted to recreate Buddhism as it had existed in Mojopahit. And they went even further, trying also to reconstruct Buddhism as they imagined it to have existed at the time of the Borobudur. In Kejawen circles, there was a popular prophecy related with the fall of Mojopahit. At the fall of Mojopahit, Sabdo Palon, who was an advisor to the last king of Mojopahit, prophesied that he would disappear, he would do moksha, mean pass to the invisible world, but he would return after 500 years and re-establish the old religion of Java. Now, traditionally, Javanese reckon the fall of Mojopahit to have occurred in the year 1478. So, towards 1978, these Javanese Buddhist revivalists, imagining that in 1978 it's going to happen. Buddhism is going to vanquish Islam. And Islam will be rolled back and Java will be Buddhist again. As we now know, this did not happen. But the sect still exists and I've been following them. The founders of the sect were Javanese and one was Balinese. And they very strongly wanted to distinguish their form of Islam as different from Chinese Islam. But what happens? They did not have many funds. They were only a very small sect. One of the founders of the sect happened to have become Dirjen, a Buddha in the Kementerian Agama. And he wanted to save the sect by marrying them with a sect that did have money and did also have the right connection. The Buddhism of Mojopahit was a tantric form of Buddhism. The only place in the world where tantric Buddhism still exists and functions is Tibet. The culturally related countries like Bhutan and North India. There happened to be a Chinese master from Taiwan who had initiations in all the 4 Tibetan schools of meditation. He had 4 silsilas that were Tibetan. And an Indonesian Chinese met this man, became his follower, and tried to establish this particular brand of Tantric Buddhism in Indonesia. Because they were culturally very, very Chinese. And this happened in the late Suharto period when Chinese culture was still not allowed. They were not allowed to have their mantras in Chinese as they would do in Taiwan. They were not allowed to use Chinese script yet. And I think that may be the reason why this Chinese tantric sect merged with the local indigenous Javanese sect. And they combined their names. The sect is now called Kasogan, the original Javanese name, following by Zenfo-dzong. And the Zenfo-dzong, which found its followers mainly among urban Chinese, including many well-heeled Chinese, is relatively wealthy. And they have been supporting the building of viharas in Javanese villages that belong to this sect. Now, this is enough background to come to why this about having second thoughts about conversion. Last year, thanks to Bayuli, Last year, we visited several villages in Temanggung. Temanggung is the paten with the highest density of Buddhist converts in Java. After the Theravada village that Yuli wanted to visit, we went to a village, Lamuk, which belonged to this particular sect that I am interested in. And speaking with the main leader of the group there, he had a very interesting talk. He said, well, in 1967, when people who had been arrested by the army came back, and when people in our villages had heard the instruction that Suharto wants everyone to have a religion, not just a belief, but a religion. We had negotiations amongst ourselves, and the Toko Masyarakat decided to become Buddhist, although no one really knew much about Buddhism yet. There was a meeting where the Toko Masyarakat, the Ketua Desa of 14 villages came together. They had all been associated with the PNI before. They came together in the house of one of the village headmen who happened to be a Christian. But after negotiating, they decided that the most appropriate religion was probably Buddhism. So these Toko Masyarakat, they converted to Buddhism and they told the village to follow. And 9 out of the 14 villages at that time followed collectively. So you have a collective conversion to Buddhism. Nobody knew what Buddhism is and what you have to do as a Buddhist. It takes time to learn. Now, I think the same is true when people convert to Islam. In the beginning, you don't know much about it, then it takes time, right? So first, a few local people started studying Buddhism with some of the Buddhist pioneers in Yogyakarta. And gradually, there were summer schools, Sunday schools teaching the basics of Buddhism. And as Buddhism in Java developed gradually, regularly monks from Thailand came by. You know, close to the Borobudur, there is a vihara where there's a number of Thai resident monks. And some of these Thai resident monks were very Puritan. They did not like the things that people in the villages did, like the Bersih Desa tradition, placing a sajen under a tree. In Puritan Buddhism, it's like Muhammadiyah finds that difficult to write. The relations with the deceased, I mean, for reformists in all religion, I think once a person is dead, I mean, they're dead and there is no relation possible. But maybe for Javanese people, how can you cut the tie? I mean, it's impossible. Yeah, you have to go and Idul Fitri for people who do not fast is still important because you do nyakar with your parents. There were also conflicts between different sects because sometimes one monk comes and another comes and they don't agree on many things. It's as if the Buddhist community is divided by many political or belief rivalries, and people felt uncomfortable. So in Lamuk, they decided, let's try to find another form of religion. As the man whom we interviewed said, masih mending NU. Because NU at least allows you to visit the graves of your parents. And people in NU do not really get very angry when you place a sajen under a tree. They're very longar. But then they managed to contact this Javanese sect, and the Taiwanese master is also very open to all forms of syncretistic religion. He allows people. He also tells you, if you join my religion, you don't have to get of earlier religions. You can continue practicing what you did before, as long as you do also our mantras and so on. So I found that so fascinating that people turn to this Javanese form of Buddhism because they had regret about the earlier conversion. And then I thought about similar cases that I'd come across. I had been interviewing a pendeta from Gunung Kidul. And Gunung Kidul was one of the regions where in the 1960s, early 1970s, people massively converted to Christianity. And there is this expression, rice Christians, mean missionaries, many from the United States, came in with a lot of rice and money and promises and building churches and so on. And people accepted that, of course, until the missionaries started telling them what they were no longer allowed to do. So the Bersih Desa and all these other things were not allowed. So there are a few studies about conversion to Christianity in those days. I have not seen any serious follow-up study about what happened to those Christians. Are they still Christians or where have they gone? The pendeta that I spoke to was a pendeta of the Gereja Kristen Java, which is the most Javanese, culturally Javanese of the Christian churches, which was founded by a Kiai, a Javanese Kiai, who converted himself to Christianity, who did not want to have colonial Christianity. He found his own Christianity. And the Gereja Kristen Java is open to all Javanese cultural expressions and cultural practices. And the pendeta claimed that for him, for his church, it's much easier to stay among the people in Gunung Kidul. In the 19th century, we see, so in the 1880s, 1890s, the number of people doing the Hajj increases very sharply because there are steamships that pass through the Straits of Suez, and it becomes, the journey becomes much easier, it takes less time, and the beginnings of mass Hajj movements begins. People who perform the Hajj still stay there long enough to learn, to at least get an ijazah in a tariqah, and perhaps study one or two kitab. And they come back and persuade their neighbors to become more scripture-oriented Muslims. And with the increasing insistence by some of the leaders of the Christian Ummah, some of the people who have the religious prestige of having performed, some people felt this pressure too harsh, and so that is not, the Sharia is not what we converted to. We are Javanese. We are Javanese Muslims. But if being Muslim means that we have to do all these things and have to study these books and have to hold on to all these prescriptions and things forbidden, that's not a religion that we feel close to. So this is the period when you see that Abangan and Santri, in the terms of Kurds, become distinct groups. Again, I Ricklefs, who has worked specifically on the letters of Christian missionaries working in Java in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, and who have observed this response. Originally, people thought that Abangan is the original knowledge, the original religion of the Javanese, and Santri is a reformist version of Abangan religion. It's Abangan minus a number of practices that Santris don't agree with. But the impression we get from the letters of the missionaries is that it is more complex. Abangan as a cultural complex is something that emerges in response to increasing Islamization. the Abangan are created by Islamization as a group that rejects particular aspects of Islamization. So another case of what I call conversion error. We converted to Islam, but now the demand as Islam, we have to do this and this and that. And that is not what that was not the original deal. We don't want that. And people revert, but when you revert, you never go back to what you were before. You have to invent something new. When people reject something that they have been, and they may believe they go back to what they were before, but the result is always something more complex, more influenced by the case than they had realized. And perhaps they invent new rituals. We also see new Kebatinan movement. I think the Kebatinan movement in the form of organized Kebatinan is also a response to Islamization. In a way, it's an imitation of the Sufi order. A Kebatinan movement usually has rules that are somewhat similar to those of Sufi orders, but it does not want to be a Sufi order. It wants to be, it cultivates the batin, like Sufis also do, but it also very much rooted in Javanese rather than Arab culture. The same might be said about the religion of the Tungur. Now, the Tungur are really a sort of Abangan. There are these stories that they are descendants from Mojapahit, and many Tungur themselves believe that. And perhaps it is true, but the Tungur religion is also quite influenced by an earlier phase of Islamization. If you look at the names, many Tungur have a name that is Arabic that's derived. They practice circumcision, and they call it khitan, which is obviously an Arabic word. And they have other practices that were clearly part of an Islamic complex. Only, again, perhaps in the late 19th century, they started to set themselves off more sharply from the Muslims of the lower lands. And then in the 1850s, the first Buddhists tried to enlist the Tangurese as Buddhists. Many communities that held on to pre-Islamic beliefs in Java called themselves Buddha, not necessarily related to Buddhism, but Buddha, Buddhi, maybe a Sanskrit, Indonesian root word. So did the Tungur. So there was an attempt to turn the Tangurese into proper Buddhists. There was even in the 50s a Buddha statue in one of the villages, Wonokitri. And today there is still one or two villages that call themselves Buddhists. But in 1967, the majority of the Tungur villages decided to opt for the other Indian religion, Hindu Bali. They have to modernize their rituals. They have now ritual specialists who are called dukun, but who have to learn mantras in Sanskrit, rather. They read literature of the Parisade Hindu Dharma, which is a reformist Hindu movement coming from, based on the Indian influences, and also has already changed much in the Balinese interpretation of religion. So when I was in Tungur, also almost 40 years ago, I noticed that besides the official dukun who were recognized by the Parisade Dharma, who were recognized by the Departement or Kemenak, by the Kementerian Agama, there were still people who called themselves dukun particulier, who practiced, but who had also followers. They were serving their people. They were not following Balinese practices, but simply, I mean, they were acting like proper Javanese dukun. So I gathered, but I should like to do more field research on that. I gathered that also those who converted formally to Hindu Bali felt that perhaps that also sits rather uneasily on a Javanese cultural identity. But here I'm speculating, but I would love to go stay there for a while and interview people about this. Now, a very different form of conversion error is the case of a village in Dieng. Now, most of you were not around when Laskar Jihad was active in these areas, right? In around 2000, you could find at the traffic lights here in Jogja, people in Jalabia selling the Risala Jihad. Many of these young men came from a village in Dieng, which I would say, well, Dieng, that must be an Abangan village, right? There's one village, Kapakisan, that had collectively become Salafi. And not just Salafi, not the sort of Salafi that now cooperates with the Ministry of Religion, but the Salafi of Jafar Abu Talib, the most Puritan of the Puritan Salafis. Now, how did this happen? Well, again, one person who was highly respected in the village, but who had traveled, who had worked in Bandung for years, came back, and probably in Bandung had been in contact with Persis, and he came back with different religious ideas, and he already started to tell his villagers, you should not believe all this nonsense about jimat, and so on. When he heard that in Wonosobo there was a recent teacher from Jafar Abu Talib's group, he contacted him and he said, you can come and do dawa in my village. And together they tried to get rid of all the traditional practices. They collected all the jimat. They had, as they said, well, a truck full of jimat, Chris and written jimat and so on, and they threw them in the crater of a volcano in the region to destroy this evil spiritual influence. At a certain time, the tokoh, the influential person in this village, dies. And then, although some people still practice Islam in the Salafi way and are still related with the network of Jafar Abu Talib, they have their conferences, their annual Muktamar at village. There is now a different form of a different transnational network that becomes more attractive. And it's all to do with the potato trade. Potato is one of the major sources of income. They were trading potatoes in Wonosobo. That's how the Salafi came in, via Wonosobo. Now they found a better way to sell potatoes in the Magelang area, where there is a pesantren of Tablighi Jamaat. And the Tablighi Jamaat is much more tolerant of local practices. They want you to try to live as much profit as possible. And they want you to go to the mosque and call all other people to pray. But they are not very Puritan. They allow people to honor their parents. Officially, they're anti-tariqat, but you can follow tariqat. And so they're much more easygoing. And there seems to have been a shift from Salafism to Tablighi Jama'ah. Again, I have not done these observations myself. It was Nur Hayy who first noticed this amazing phenomenon of a Salafi village in Dieng. And a student of Nur Hayy, Chris Mono, who wrote a dissertation about the whole process. And later I asked Chris Mono also to look at Gunung Kidul, another formerly heavily Abangan area, and see what happened there. How many more minutes do I have? 10. Well, then I have to go to theories of conversion. My wife told me, Martin, don't stand there and tell just, I saw this that is interesting, I saw that is interesting. Young people want to know theory. So, here, this is for Rini. In the first place, we have seen two forms of conversion. We have seen collective conversion, and there are individual cases of conversion. The explanations of these conversions are obviously different one from the other. In collective conversion, economic factors are often important. Trade relations are often important because information comes with trade relations. Financial inducements. Another colleague, Robert Hefner, who studied the Tanger for many years, writes about the enormous financial investment in building mosques and madrasas in the areas that used to be Tanger, especially on the side of Malang. If you travel to Bromo from the side of Malang, I mean, it's amazing how many loudspeakers you hear and how many posh buildings you see there. A few days ago, we went from the side of Probolinggo. It's not so heavy there. So the capital is clearly focusing most on the Malang side, but that definitely played an important part in collective inducement to turn to Islam. Missionaries who came here in the late 60s and early 70s producing these rice Christians also brought money as inducement. Now, we can always wonder how lasting is such a conversion. And I think it's especially these kind of collective conversions due to financial or political inducements that may lead to second thoughts when the conditions change. Anyway, the conversion is never an event that happens in one day or 1 year. It takes many, many generations before the process of conversion is complete. Individual coercions often involve people who are not average persons. They are more curious, more enterprising, more daring, more courageous. And, well, they have access to moral and economic resources. Marriage is an important aspect in conversions. Like, did I say that when we were in Bali, in this Buddhist temple, the only Balinese families who converted to Buddha were those where the woman was Balinese, the man was Chinese, and together they found a Buddhism that was appropriate to both of them. There's another look at conversion. Look at the content. The important form of conversion that I've discussed in the villages of Temanggung and also in the Tanger region is a conversion from a religious attitude focused on local spiritual forces, the Danyang, the Holy Spirit of the village, or the ancestors of the village, local practices related to ancestors and forest spirits, river spirits. We find that people who leave the village, I mean, if you used to go to the Danyang of your village, the shrine by the village saint or the village founder is believed to be located, and you bring an offering there once a year, once a month, once a week, and then you leave your village, you go to a place far away, this form of religion stops because you can't take your ancestor with you. You can't take the Danyang with you. You can't take the forest with you. You come in a different environment where a different kind of spirits are perhaps more likely to be helpful. If you need spiritual help and you cannot go to your ancestor, you can go to a Muslim saint, or you can try to pray directly to the Prophet. So for those who travel far, and that includes traders, for those who travel far, a universal religion that has a God who can be prayed to everywhere, that has a range of saints that mark different parts of the countryside, where you can perform pilgrimage everywhere. Religion, a universal religion, is more practical, seems to offer more spiritual help than a local religion. In the 18th century, many Balinese people left Bali. There were wars between the various Balinese kingdoms, and captives in the war were sold as slaves to the East India Company. Batavia, to some extent, populated by slaves from Bali. One of the oldest mosques in Bali, in Jakarta, is built by Balinese. So we see that the Balinese, once they had left Bali, I mean, their religion of Bali is so strongly tied to the subak, to a local shrine, to local spirits, that when you leave Bali, I mean, you leave your religion behind. Still, many people in Bali feel that if you leave Bali, you're no longer Balinese. So these Balinese who were brought to Jakarta, actively converted to Islam. And in the neighborhood around the mosque, they know this history, but they see there are no Balinese here anymore. I mean, the Balinese have merged into the Betawi. The Betawi have a number of different origins, part Chinese, part Balinese, part Sundanese. The Balinese have completely disappeared, have become Betawi. And Muslims. I mentioned marriage as an important possible factor in conversion. Missionaries and du'at, have known this. Often we see that the person who wants to be a missionary in an area marries a local woman, and through marriage becomes, to some extent, a local person and can try to convert the local population. Now, many things are possible in religious change, but not every conversion is as likely as any other conversion. There are certain unequal terms of trade. Like, let's go back to a Buddhist village in Temanggung, where the entire village is Buddhist, but they want their children to go to school. They can go to the SD in Temanggung, but then they go to SMP, SMA, and perhaps even a university, where they meet with people who have a different religion, most likely many Muslims. And they want to integrate in their circle of friends. So when they're not at home, they start socializing Muslims, start following Muslims, and perhaps even officially convert to Islam. When they come back to the village, they still return to the practices of the village, but they have become Muslims. In one village, people are not allowed to settle if they are really Muslim. They can only come back if they're still Buddhist. But I see that the terms of exchange are very unequal. The pressure to find benefit from associating with Muslims is very strong. Maintaining a Buddhist identity, being a small minority, wherever you go, without having people that can offer you patronage, that can help you, it is very, very hard. And I think the existence of the small village communities is quite precarious. Mass education and urbanization are two processes that are taking place all over the world. They really undermine the foundations of all these local varieties of religion. Through migration, people are off from the roots, the spiritual roots of the holy sites in their village, and the pressure to adopt one of the world religions is much stronger. There had been a strong political pressure to come to one of the great religions, and I had expected after the fall of Suharto, to see perhaps a revival of Kejawen, of Kebatinan movements that had been suppressed, that had continued underground. But as we know now, I mean, their social foundations had already been uprooted. There's no serious revival to be seen anymore. Or perhaps not yet, as some of the hopeful Buddhists of the 1970s thought. Perhaps miscalculation. Perhaps it's not 1978, but some other year that another religion will return. Conversion, religious change, fascinating phenomenon to observe, especially because it is always changing. There will always be things that we have not predicted and that we can only try to explain in retrospect. Thank you for your attention and forgive me for being a bit chaotic.
Okay. Thank you very much. And just, there is a lot. There are a lot of people here. Yeah. Before welcome to Wednesday Forum. For the attendance that newcomer to here, and I forgot to introduce you in the first. Sorry, I'm sorry. Apologize. So, Pak Martin is okay. So for the newcomers who doesn't know him, Pak Martin is a professor emeritus of comparative studies of modern Muslim societies at Utrecht University. He an anthropologist with strong interest in politics, history, and philology, and much of his work studies and boundaries between these disciplines. He has conducted extensive fieldwork in Kurdistan and Indonesia, and he has taught on subjects ranging from Ottoman history and sociology of religion to theory of nationalism. His Indonesian publications include Tarekat Naksabandiyah di Indonesia, NU Tradisi, Relasi-relasi Kuasa, Pencarian Wacana Baru, Kitab Kuning, Antren dan Tarekat, Rakyat Kecil, Islam dan Politik, and Conservative Turn, Islam Indonesia dalam Ancaman Fundamentalisme. So, from the discussion about conversion errors, after he presents, maybe there are some questions from the audience, maybe? Any questions? Raise your hand. Okay, wait, huh? Okay.
I have a short question, Pak Martin. It's very interesting. Thank you very much for the presentation and the updates about what is going on the ground. So you mentioned about the case in Salafi, Gunung Kidul, in which you saw a reflux where people actually opted more for the easygoing form of Islam as compared to a Puritan form of Islam. So I'm just, how does this challenge the argument of conservative turn that you and some friends wrote a few years back? So is this a challenge? Not a challenge. Is this, so do you see that this will actually berhadapan with the rise of religious radicalism? So on the one hand, we saw religious radicalism, but on the other hand, we actually also saw the rise of people who, you know, reject or opted more for a more easygoing form of religion. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I have to think again about what my argument was in the religious conservative turn, but perhaps I have to repeat that conservative is not the same as fundamentalist. You find conservatives in Nahdlatul Ulama, and you find conservatives in Muhammadiyah. And progressives in Nahdlatul Ulama, and you find progressives in Muhammadiyah. You find even progressive Salafis. You find feminist Salafis. So, no, I don't think it has much to do with conservative turn. But perhaps it may say something about what in the long run will be the form of Islam? How will Islam change? As we have seen from this 14th, 15th century to the 20th, we've seen many of these forms of reform in which Wahdat al-Wujud mysticism is rejected in favor of a more Ghazali type of mysticism. Personal mysticism is rejected in favor of organized mysticism of the Sufi orders. Among the Sufi orders, we find that the Shatariya, which was the massive Sufi order of Java, has gradually been replaced by the more orthodox Naqshbandiya Sufi order. Since I'm speaking to a Sharifa now, we might say that even in Hadrami circles, there has been many shifts also in practices, not just the shift from Jam al-Khair to al-Irshad, but even in daily practices, there have been forms of purification of practices. Certain ratib have been rejected. The Maulids, the Maulid that used to be most popular in Indonesia, the Barzinji, has been replaced by Simtal, what is it called? Simtal Duror, and so on. So there are shifts. And I think overall the shifts are in a purifying direction. But it is a process that goes up and down. It's a wave. It's not a process in one way. There may be reversions. A reversion is not really a reversion to a place where you've been before. But if you step back from a more Puritan form of Islam to something more easygoing, what you get is not what it was, but because it is already influenced by the period that you were in this more Puritan environment. So it's an ongoing, but generally we may say it is still in a more Puritan direction. Among intellectuals, and I expect a certain percentage of people present in this hall will feel more sympathy with the emergence or re-emergence of spiritual movements within Islam or within the other major religions, and within respect for local communities and their traditions. But I think that sociologically speaking, these things like local traditions are more likely to disappear in favor of new forms of more global Islam.
Okay. Also, who else want to give a question and criticize statement? Oh. Oh.
Hello, Pak Martin. Well, I'm not sure how to formulate the question. I just thinking that does the change, social change, always religious change? What I'm thinking now is about Islamization or Islamicization. It's from Marshall Hudson, Islamic Kid. So it's that it's a social change rather than religious change. So for example, like when we think about the indigenous communities, so they want to protect or preserve their belief system, for example. But I'm thinking back to, I'm sorry, I don't know how to. I'm thinking about the work of Nancy Florida. In one of her interview, how Java it becomes so massively Muslim in a very rapid way, and one of the answer is because the value, the ethics, the belief system of the indigenous, and Islam, the Sufi Islam, is the same. That's why they can easily accept Islam, because actually it's the same. The essence is the same. So, and because of the essence of the same, then no need to convert to Islam. Although they take the, let's say, the explanation of like the soul and everything with Islamic terms, not necessarily need to convert to Islam. So why I discuss about this, because I studied indigenous communities like adat, masyarakat adat, but they are now Muslim. So they don't convert fully to Islam because they found that, well, at the end, the essence is the same between our belief and is what the minorist Muslim teach us. But so no need to take, but it's okay for our kids to learn Islam. But then to maintain their tradition, of course, they do something else, right? So like there are many strategies to protect their adat. For example, like geographical boundaries. For example, this is adat, and then this is Islam, like the case in Amato, Sulawesi. And then the migration, it's also part of the, in my argument, it's part of the strategy to maintain their tradition, because when they migrate to other places, so when they stay in one village, and then modernity come in, Islam came in, and then it's mixed there, and then okay, now we have to go. So it's that's why what I'm thinking is not fully Islamization, but also the process is also Islamicization.
Yeah, I think I understand what you mean, and it is perhaps very similar to what I said about the Tunger, where, like Nancy Florida's Javanese influence, say, of course, our values are the same as Islamic values. So, of course, we can be very easily Islamicized because it's the same moral system that we adhere to. Only then later comes someone who has studied Sharia, and he tells them, but what you do is not proper. And that's what happened to the Tunger. They were doing things, they felt Javanese culture, Islam are the same. They consider the Prophet Muhammad the founder of the Kropak and of the Javanese script. Javanese culture was brought by the Prophet Muhammad. But when people came back from the Hajj and told them, but real Islam means that you have to go to the mosque, you have to pray 5 times a day, and on Friday you have to go to do the Friday prayer, and you cannot drink alcohol, and there was no pork there, but you cannot eat pork. Then people suddenly say, well, I didn't know, but I thought Islam is a spiritual religion, and it is compatible with my own form of spirituality. But when these people come who teach Islam as a system of strict behavioral rules, then they take distance. That's good. They started to redefine their religion as non-Islam.
What do you call it? Back to the old tradition. At the beginning, perhaps there's no problem, right? Of being Japanese and being Muslim, but then came later, especially the modern Islam, for example, like Salafi and else. So it's become like, oh, they clarified, this is Islam, this is not. So then, okay, we have to choose.
Well, the popularity of this concept of Islam Nusantara, which everyone has his own definition of what is Islam Nusantara. But it's clear Islam Nusantara is different from Islam Arab. And if people come who have studied in the Middle East and they come and tell you how to practice Islam, you say, well, no, this is Nusantara. And if you're a majority, you can still say, no, this is Nusantara. Still, like NU can do because they are massive, they can survive. Their Islam Nusantara has enough manpower to resist the Puritan Empire. But if you're a small Adat community, it is more difficult to maintain your position.
Yeah, probably partly I want to continue Jim's question. But I have two questions. One is short, the other one probably a bit long. And the first one is probably also methodological. I mean, when you say, I mean, the subjects in your story, the people who regrets their conversion, who are they? And yeah, I mean, so this is my second question now. And also actually the first question, how did you find them? I mean, where they are? I mean, if there's a special group. But this is related to my other question because I was thinking probably it's also an issue about how do we describe this phenomenon? And maybe not much of it is new. Probably this is the same or similar phenomenon which has existed for a long time, but there are different groups. But now we see this, in the past we saw different groups, etc. So I was thinking, like, for example, in 1945, for example, Wongsonegoro, when he had this idea, I mean, to change Article 29 of the Constitution, part of the argument, and it says, well, it says religion and then belief. And I think part of the argument, which he made very clear, is that he doesn't want religion to be given particular, mostly orthodox meaning, but people can have very different beliefs even within this particular religion. And we know Wongsonegoro is part of the Kebatinan. So, I mean, there are people like that since a long time ago, and probably there are still. I mean, these groups are still there. They underwent many things, and then in 1965, of course, there's so much pressure on them, which partly contribute to the conversion, etc. This is not new, and maybe when now after 2017 Constitutional Court decision, certain groups, they assert their identities. These are the same identities which they had like in the past, couldn't express it, but now they have more space to express it. So maybe this is not, well, I don't know again who people you're talking about. Maybe they are not the people who regret, but it's been there. Another example is the people who converted mostly in 1965, and now they completely left their religion. For example, like Catholics in West Java, Sunda Wiwitan, and then in Kalimantan also living Hindu. Maybe this is also a different phenomenon which needs a different. Yeah. So, and I think I don't know whether you can say that they regret. Because I mean, the initial conversion was actually really political for protection. Yeah. And when the space is open now, after 1998, and then now after 2017, etc., then it becomes easy again to assert their identity. So, yeah. So basically, I hope you get my point. How do we describe, I mean, the possibility that there are different groups, actually? Thank you.
Yeah, well, your first question was, how do you find these people? Well, I mean, I have not been looking for them. I mean, I've been traveling around for 40 years, and from time to time I meet someone. And sometimes in retrospect, I think, oh, but what I heard someone say 10 years ago now makes sense in this perspective, that they had been feeling protected under the umbrella of an official religion. They had been sent to school where they got official textbooks of the religion and so on. And then they suddenly realized that it was forced on them. And they try to go back, and I think there I disagree with you, that you cannot go back to what you were or what you were in secret. Because if you follow a religion, even if it is imposed on you by force, but you follow its practices and you have to memorize its formulas, you have to know its main points of belief, this cannot not affect you. It has an influence on what you, and even if you leave the religion, people who leave the church, who leave the vihara, are still very much influenced in their thought, in their feelings, in their body language even, by the religion that they have practiced for several years and that they now say this goodbye to. You can't suddenly become the person who you were 40 years ago and do away with this influence of the religion that you lived for some years. So what we see with Sunda Vivitan is it's a reinvention, it's a reconstruction, it's basically something new. They claim to be the original Busunda religion, but what they do, how they formulate it, it is a reinvention of it. And especially in bringing together all these very divergent Kebatinan-like sects and Agama Sunda Jawa and the tradition of the Baduy, it's a like creating like a patchwork quilt out of all the tradition, making something that is new, making a new celebration, the Serentaun, a new celebration that perhaps was never existing in the same form before. So that is where I may differ with you, that the return to a tradition is always also a re-engine, and it is modern. It is not entirely traditional.
Okay. Any question also? Okay.
Hi, Pat Martin. Thanks. Really interesting, fascinating discussion. I was wanting maybe for you to reflect a little bit more about, you mentioned a number of times about sort of a marker of how you can tell that how people have become Islamicized or returning to tradition about their participation in public rituals, like you mentioned Bersih Desa a number of times. I wondered if you could, and I think in my research in Gunung Kidul also, it's interesting the difference in how these rituals are practiced in each, not only in each area, but even in each village. They're practiced very distinctively and have different elements of Javanese or other types of traditions. But what I wanted to know is, to what extent do you think, I may be picking up on what Pat Zane said about the idea of regret or other ways of looking at it, the relationship between public rituals, which would then be sanctioned by whoever's in charge of that village or that area, and what's allowed in those public rituals, as opposed to the private rituals or the group rituals. So the people who will go and meditate in the mountains, regardless of what they're called, they're still going to go and do, or they'll still ziyarah, they'll still go to their the graves of their ancestors, regardless of whatever else happens. But they're doing it privately or with a small group, not what's publicly sanctioned by the village. So what do you think is kind of the relationship between the sort of practice of rituals that people maintain versus what's kind of authorized or accepted publicly in different spaces, whether those spaces are religious or civic in that sense? Thank you.
I'm afraid I will have to have some time to reflect on that. Of course, the officially allowed collective rituals are choreographed by a locally powerful person, or perhaps by, well, they say tradition, but there is always people who are the upholders of tradition, and every year they remember the tradition differently. So I think there must be a few religious entrepreneurs who are in charge of these things. And some of these entrepreneurs may themselves also be privately exploring a spiritual path in a mountain cave. Others may not at all. They may just be the village entrepreneur, whereas people who go to the village may try to escape from this sort of collective influence. They have a personal search for power, basically, right? Spiritual advancement, but spiritual advancement in Java is often in the form of power. The search for power is inherently, I think, individual. And it's therefore a different part of the Javanese past than the collective ritual. The collective ritual concerns a responsibility to the ancestors or the spirits village, who sometimes may be ancestors, sometimes not. They may be natural spirits, but it's a collective responsibility of the village. So things seem to be quite independent one of the other.
Yeah, I think like you said, there is a private of, let's say, even the leaders, the people who manage these public rituals may have their own personal practice. But also, in my experience, seeing there are people who see themselves as the keepers of the tradition. So, they will still go and give offerings to areas, even if the village doesn't accept it, because they see that they're keeping the tradition alive, even on behalf of the whole village. Right. But then maybe someone else will come and remove that because they think that's not acceptable or shouldn't be allowed in the village. So there's kind of a, there's a sense in which there's a kind of a competition for what's accepted in the public space. But then there are people who are, so I mean, the idea of regret is the idea that you made a choice and then you changed your mind. But this is much more of like a, what's acceptable, what's allowed, and how can we creatively manage those differences? But what happens in a lot of villages now in Gunung Kidul is that in the public ritual, it's very Islamicized. But then if you go to the spot just before or just after, you see people with incense, with all of the more Javanese traditions, and they're sort of on the margins still doing it. But it's not a part of the public accepted ritual, but it's also not being disallowed, but it's just not being completely formally sanctioned. So there's just ways that it kind of can exist. So
Fascinating process of negotiation.
Yeah, no. Yeah, Jonathan's question helps me probably to think about my question. The key word is coexist. I was thinking, how do you define conversion? Seems like conversion is like drawing a line. While many of the stories actually is the blurring of the lines. Like it's not, I'm doing this, I'm converting from this, going here, and then I regret, and then I come back, or I leave it, I went to other place, as if there are these clear lines. So yeah, I guess my uneasiness is in that kind of understanding. If you don't describe it as conversion, probably it becomes more longer, like you said, which happens everywhere. People don't have to state exactly this is my belonging or my allegiation or my religion, but so I mean, so when you use conversion errors, do you speak of particular groups which, I mean, like draw these clear boundaries, or so my first question actually.
Oh, well, both the errors and the conversions should be very blurred. I did not define conversion, and I don't think I would ever like to define what conversion is, but some processes we call conversion loosely. And then, well, as I said at the beginning, when people accepted Islam or certain practices of Islam, they took them on as something additional to the repertoire of spiritual practice and beliefs that they already had. So they added Islam to it. I didn't subtract anything from what I already had. And then reform is then gradually getting rid of those things that are not sufficiently Islamic in the views of contemporaries. I also spoke of conversion when we were talking about Abangan becoming Salafi or Abangan becoming joining NU. I might even call a conversion from Nahdlatul Ulama to Muhammadiyah a conversion, if that is part of a deliberate process, or perhaps even if it happens spontaneously. We talk about the role of marriage in conversion. Then of course, I'm thinking of mixed marriages and how they impact both the partners and also the choices in life of the children. And how when we have a few religions of which one is clearly dominant in numbers and economic power, the terms of trade in all these processes, these exchanges of marriages and the choice left to the children seem to point to a strong pressure towards gradual further Islamization, if not at least Islamicization. I mean, but Islamic culture already has, there is hardly any culture in Indonesia that has not already very deeply colored, influenced by Islam. Many Christians are also Islamic in a sense, and certainly the smaller religions.
Okay, maybe one more question. Anyone to raise question? Okay.
Actually, I wonder, one question actually, why you name your presentation as conversion error? That's one. I mean, whose error?
Yes.
Who think it is error? The first one.
Very good question.
Because just like one of the Mbak Yuli students have a thesis about the Buddhist Jawi community in Kulon Progo. It's interesting because when they think that, when many people say that you're practicing wrong Buddhism, and they said no, we tried. So instead of saying no, they try to negotiate and try to make their own way what is right Buddhism. So instead of, they find themselves, they have autonomy to find themselves, actively find what is their religion, something like that. So, yeah, I wonder, when you say conversion errors, yeah, error bagi siapa atau error menurut siapa, something like that.
Terima kasih. Well, I told Julie I will try to think of a catchy and provocative title, and then this came to mind. Not much serious thought, really. But the idea is that people feel that they belong to one particular jamaat or umat, and they feel it is really what they want. They get disaffected to some extent. That situation has occurred in different religions, in different communities. And I said, well, okay, let's call it conversion error. We converted to the wrong religion or the wrong form of my religion. And then how else, from Kejawen, how can I survive? What should my religious choices be after this error?
Okay, maybe we still have time. One more last question, maybe for who have a curious to the presentation for a student.
What the patriot said when he tried to define this is Islam, this is Java, this is pre-Hindu like that. So I don't know.
I meant an error in the perception of the people who holds the religion. Who say so, well, I'm a Muslim, but now I'm told to do this. And that's not really how I understood Islam. Did I make an error?
But they don't do that. I mean, I know, it's a provocative one, but it's give the tendency like, you could say like, this is Islam, this is Jawa, this is pre-Hindu. So, like, Nancy for the argument, we cannot separate between Islam and Jawa in the end, because, yeah, it's so blurring boundaries. So that's why the question comes up, what is the conversion? What do I conversion? Something like that. So, yeah, because the boundaries is so blur. So I think, yeah, we have all of error understanding now and then. you know, I don't know. I mean, like, that's kind of provocative. I think I don't know. It tends something like, yeah. They're like synonym or whatever, which you may use. Yeah.
Religious change, religious dynamic. Doesn't that sound a bit boring? Religious confusion. Yes, yes, yes. Well, a few months ago, I gave a talk in Austria, and it's about translations and so on. And then suddenly I remembered I have a CD by musicians from that city, and they're all from Balkan countries, and the CD confusion, because there are so many borders, and people could get confused where they come from, where they belong to, and so on. So, of course, religious confusion, if it is without consequences, without judgment, and so on, religious confusion might be an interesting situation to be in.
Okay. I think maybe anyone, or maybe it's enough. Oh.
From the very beginning, I had the feeling that, the conversion is normally associated with religion. And even if you think in terms of religious change or religious transformation, but is the label religion appropriate here? I think that's part of the conclusion, because you talk about political changes, you talk about economic changes, you talk about culture, you talk about us, them, and so on. You even talk about wars. So I think one of the questions come to my mind. We are talking about transformations in a society, but the label religious is not very clear to me, at least.
No, but in Indonesia, the word agama has a clear definition. Well, there are many things that are not agama, right? Religion in English, I think, includes much more than agama does in Indonesia.
For example, even with the so-called Islamization, we usually frame that in religious terms. But is that a correct way of looking at it, or are there societal transformations in the society? There are so many trends in the society that are clearly anti-Islam, although labeled Islamic. So that makes it confusing. And particularly the examples that you gave, I asked myself, but what is the religious dimension here?
Well, many of the actors I'm mentioning, whether they're monks from Thailand or Salafi du'at, Salafi preachers, or Christian missionaries, they see themselves as acting in a religious capacity. Religion, although you may say, well, there is much politics behind it, there is a lot of money behind it, there are other interests behind it. A wide range of phenomena. I think generally we agree about what belongs to the religious sphere.
The only thing I want to say is that maybe we should try to look at this phenomenon not through a religious lens.
You want to look at it through what sort of lens? A cultural lens? An economic lens?
Yeah, or I mean, deeper societal transformations, both framed in economic, political, cultural, ethnic. There are so many things going on in this society. And we frame it so easily in religious terms. And that is a bit my uneasiness with the term conversion or the alternatives, religious change or religious transformation or whatever.
Yes, but now if we look at religious social organizations like NU and Muhammadiyah becoming entrepreneurs in mining, tin mining, possibly. Of course, this is part of a political process. And it has an economic component. It has an environmental component. But they are invited to come in this because they're religious actors and they can mobilize people on the basis of religious identity, not on the basis of economics or environmentalism and so on. So yes, I would still call this religion, religion being mobilized for political ends.
Thank you very much, Pa Martin. That's very awesome discussion for this Wednesday. All right. It's 3 p.m. already. Maybe before we close this discussion, maybe we have a gift for you. Huh? Yes. Maybe Pa Zen can give. Chứ? Pak Zen. Maybe, sorry. Okay. Okay. Put your target on the peak. Don't forget to come Wednesday Forum next week. Okay. So because tomorrow we will discuss about between mountain and sea. It will be discussed with by Arah Mayani. So don't forget to come and keep update from the CRCS and ICRS activities in the social media, YouTube, etc. Okay. See you next week. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Will you stay in Egypt? Ya, sebentar. Saya dapatin ya, Wil. Apa lagi? Itu
Gak ada Puma, gak ada Leo. Siapa yang nulis?
Nah itu, nggak tahu. Tapi nanti Mas Sakti.
Enggak, aku nggak percaya dengan optimisme itu. Mungkin. Tapi khawatirnya aku yang diserangkan. Moderator tulis lagi.
Gini, power.
Wah. Udah nugas.
Ayo syarat.
Yeah, almost like here. That's not saja nanti aku balik lagi.